At first, the driver thought it was only a small fire on the side of a quiet rural road. It was the 4th of December, 2009, in North Stonington, Connecticut. Jeremy Hill Road was dark, ordinary, and almost empty, the kind of place where a small glow on the shoulder could be mistaken for burning brush. But when the driver looked closer, the truth became impossible to unsee. It was not brush. It was a human body on fire. By the time Connecticut State Police, firefighters, and emergency responders arrived, the scene had already become something far darker than a roadside fire. The road was shut down. Investigators moved in. Evidence was collected. And at the center of it all was a young woman whose name police did not yet know. Later, she would be identified as 24-year-old Rebecca Koster from Medford, New York. But in that first moment, before the dental records, before the missing person report, before the arrest, before the trial, Rebecca was a body on the side of the road, and someone had tried to erase her from the world. Before this became a murder case, before it became a trial, before lawyers argued over autopsy reports and constitutional rights, Rebecca Koster was a 24-year-old woman with a family waiting for her to come home. That is what makes this case so heavy. Because for a short period of time, there were two separate nightmares unfolding at once. In Connecticut, investigators had found a body burning beside a rural road. In New York, Rebecca's family was searching for a daughter who had vanished. And when those two realities finally collided, the mystery did not end. It only became more painful. This case is not just about the violence that took Rebecca's life. It is also about what happened after the attempt to hide her, the evidence that slowly brought her name back, and the legal fight that would continue for more than a decade after her death. Because in the end, Rebecca's story raises one devastating question. When a victim can no longer speak for herself, how strong does the evidence have to be before the truth can stand? Before Rebecca Koster became the name attached to a homicide case, she was a 24-year-old woman from Medford, New York, young enough that most of her life was still supposed to be ahead of her. The public record does not preserve every detail of who Rebecca was. It does not tell us every habit, every dream, every private conversation, or every small thing her family loved about her. And maybe that absence is part of what makes her story feel so painful. Because when a violent crime happens, the legal system often records the worst day in sharp detail, while the life before it is left in fragments. But Rebecca was not a fragment. She was not just the person found on Jeremy Hill Road. She was not just the subject of an autopsy report, a missing person investigation, or a trial transcript. She was a daughter. She was a young woman with people who noticed when she was gone. She had a home to return to, a name her family kept calling, and a place in the world that could not simply disappear because someone tried to make it disappear. That is one of the cruelest parts of this case. Whoever left Rebecca in Connecticut did more than abandon a body. The condition in which she was found suggests an attempt to delay recognition, to make investigators work harder to know who she was, and to separate her from the life she had lived in New York. But even that attempt failed. Her name came back, through police work, through records, through the connection between a missing young woman in Suffolk County and a body found across state lines. Rebecca was identified. And once her name was known, the case changed. This was no longer an unidentified victim on a dark rural road. This was Rebecca Koster, 24 years old, from Medford, whose final hours now had to be reconstructed with care. To tell her story properly, the focus cannot stay only on the fire, the evidence, or the man later accused in her death. It has to begin with the fact that Rebecca was alive before all of this. She had a life before the crime scene. She had a family before the investigation. She had a name before the court file. And the tragedy is not only that her life ended, it is that someone tried to make her vanish after it did. To understand how quickly Rebecca Koster's life narrowed into danger, the story has to move back from the quiet road in Connecticut to the night before in New York. Rebecca lived in Medford, on Long Island. Like many people in their 20s, her world was not supposed to be defined by court records or crime scene photographs. It was supposed to be made of ordinary routines, family, friends, nights out, rides home, and the small decisions that usually disappear from memory by the next morning. But in this case, those small decisions would later become evidence. On the night before her body was found, Rebecca was out in Patchogue, New York, at a bar called Butcher Boys. It was the kind of place where a night could feel normal, until investigators later returned to every movement, every conversation, every frame of video, trying to understand how a young woman who had gone out in Suffolk County ended up dead across state lines. That is one of the reasons this case feels so unsettling. There was no obvious warning at the beginning. No public record suggests that Rebecca walked into that night knowing she was stepping toward danger. Nothing about going to a bar, speaking with someone, or returning home should have led to what happened next. But after her death, those ordinary moments were pulled apart and examined with a precision no one could have imagined at the time. Court records would later place Evans Ganthier inside that same timeline. He was not a stranger who appeared only after Rebecca vanished. He was someone investigators connected to her through the events of that night and the evidence that followed. Security footage, phone records, physical evidence, and eventually his own statements would become part of the larger picture. But at this stage of the story, before the arrest and before the trial, what mattered most was simpler and more frightening. Rebecca had crossed paths with a man who would later become central to the investigation into her death. The night did not immediately look like a crime. Rebecca left the bar. She had people around her. There were still ordinary explanations for where she might be and what she might be doing. That is often how cases like this begin, not with a single moment of clear panic, but with a delay, a silence, a person not answering, a family beginning to feel that something is wrong before the system has enough information to call it what it is. By the time investigators began reconstructing Rebecca's final hours, every piece of the timeline mattered. Who saw her last? Who contacted her? Where she went after leaving the bar? When she was last known to be alive? And how her body ended up on Jeremy Hill Road in Connecticut? The danger in this case did not announce itself all at once. It revealed itself backward from the burned remains on the roadside, back through the missing person report, back through the bar, back through the calls and movements that brought Rebecca into Ganthier's orbit. And once investigators began following that trail, the story was no longer just about where Rebecca was found. It became about how she got there. The timeline of Rebecca Koster's final day begins in the early morning hours of the 4th of December, 2009. By then, Rebecca had been out in Patchogue, New York, at Butcher Boys, a bar on Long Island. It was late, the kind of hour when a night out is supposed to be ending. People are tired. Plans become simple. Find a ride, go home, sleep it off, wake up the next morning. For Rebecca, that morning never came. Court records later placed Evans Ganthier inside that same early morning timeline. Rebecca and Ganthier had contact at the bar, and investigators would eventually use surveillance footage, phone records, physical evidence, and Ganthier's own statements to reconstruct what happened after that night began to unravel. But the timeline was not as simple as Rebecca leaving the bar with him. According to later court summaries, Rebecca left Butcher Boys around 3:03 a.m. She was not alone with Ganthier at that moment. She was driven home by someone from her group, with others in the car, by approximately 3:30 a.m. Rebecca had made it back home. That detail matters because it shows Rebecca's night did not visibly turn dangerous at the bar itself. She got home. She was still within the ordinary rhythm of a late night out. But sometime after that, the story shifted. Ganthier would later tell police that he and Rebecca ended up together again. His version was that Rebecca became sick in his car, and then, while at his garage, she slipped, fell, struck her head on the concrete floor, and began bleeding badly. According to him, he tried to drive her to a hospital, but she died in his car before he got there. That was his explanation. But what happened next made that explanation almost impossible to accept at face value. If Rebecca had suffered a tragic accident, the normal response would have been to call 911, drive to the nearest emergency room, or immediately contact police. Ganthier did not do that. By his own account, he panicked. Instead of reporting Rebecca's death, he began making decisions that moved the case away from accident and toward concealment. The timeline now crossed into something darker. Rebecca's body was moved. She was taken out of New York and into Connecticut. Her remains were left along Jeremy Hill Road in North Stonington, a quiet rural area far from where her night had started. Then her body was set on fire. By 7:23 p.m. that evening, a 911 call came in. A passing motorist had seen what looked like a brush fire on the side of the road. But when emergency responders arrived, they discovered it was not burning brush. It was a human body. At that point, police did not yet have Rebecca's name. They had a scene. They had fire. They had remains. They had a road that needed to be shut down, and evidence that had to be protected before the night, the weather, or the damage from the flames could take anything else away. The timeline of December 4 does not just tell the audience where Rebecca was. It tells them how quickly an ordinary night turned into a homicide investigation. In less than 24 hours, Rebecca went from a young woman out at a bar in Patchogue to someone last seen alive in a narrowing window of time, to an unidentified body burning beside a road in Connecticut. And once investigators began working backward from Jeremy Hill Road, every hour of that day became evidence. By the time Rebecca Koster's body was found on Jeremy Hill Road, the case had already crossed the point it could never come back from. This was no longer a missing person concern. It was no longer a confusing timeline after a night out. It was no longer a question of whether Rebecca had simply gone somewhere without telling anyone. A young woman was dead, and someone had taken deliberate steps to make that death harder to understand. The location itself mattered. Rebecca was from Medford, New York. Her final known movements were tied to Suffolk County, but her body was found in North Stonington, Connecticut, more than a simple wrong turn away from where her night had started. That distance told investigators something immediately. Wherever Rebecca died, she had been moved. And she had not been moved gently. She had not been taken somewhere to get help. She had been taken somewhere isolated enough that a person could leave her beside a road and set a fire. The person who called 911 first believed they were seeing a small roadside blaze. That detail is chilling because it shows how close Rebecca came to being reduced to something unrecognizable before anyone even understood what they were looking at. A stranger passing by saw the glow, slowed down, and realized the scene was not ordinary at all. Emergency responders arrived and found a body burning beside the road. From that moment, the scene became a race against loss. Fire destroys. It changes surfaces. It consumes clothing, skin, fibers, trace evidence, and anything that might help tell the story of what happened before the flames began. Investigators had to preserve what remained, secure the area, and begin the painful work of turning a damaged scene back into evidence. There is a cruelty in cases like this that goes beyond the killing itself, because setting a body on fire is not just an act of panic. It is an act of erasure. It can delay identification. It can complicate forensic findings. It can create confusion around injuries. It can force investigators to begin the case not with a person, but with remains that someone has tried to strip of identity. But Rebecca's identity did not disappear. Even though the scene was damaged, police continued working backward. The body was examined. Records were checked. Information moved between Connecticut and Suffolk County, and eventually, the unidentified woman on Jeremy Hill Road was connected to a missing 24-year-old from Medford. Her name came back into the case, Rebecca Koster. That identification changed the investigation. It gave detectives a starting point beyond the road. Now they could trace her last known contacts. They could return to the bar in Patchogue. They could speak to friends, family, and witnesses. They could look at phone activity, surveillance footage, and anyone who had crossed paths with her in those final hours. The fire had been meant to hide the story. Instead, it became part of the story. Because once investigators knew who Rebecca was, the question shifted. It was no longer only, who is this woman? It became, who brought Rebecca here? And even more importantly, what happened to her before the fire? For Rebecca Koster's family, the nightmare did not begin with a courtroom, an autopsy report, or a legal argument. It began with absence. A daughter did not come home. A young woman who should have been reachable was suddenly missing from the ordinary places where people expected to find her. At first, there may have been room for confusion, a late night, a dead phone, a delay, a misunderstanding. But families know patterns. They know when silence feels wrong. They know when a missing call becomes more than a missed call. And soon, Rebecca was not simply away. She was missing. In Suffolk County, New York, her family reported her missing, setting off the first half of a story that investigators did not yet know was already connected to a crime scene in another state. While her loved ones were trying to understand where she had gone, police in Connecticut were dealing with something horrifying and unidentified. A body found burning beside Jeremy Hill Road in North Stonington. At that point, these were two separate realities. In New York, there was a family searching for Rebecca. In Connecticut, there was a woman without a name. The distance between those two facts is one of the most painful spaces in any missing person case. Families are forced to live inside uncertainty. They do not know whether to hope, panic, wait, search, or prepare themselves for the worst. Every hour stretches. Every unanswered question becomes heavier. And because the truth has not arrived yet, the mind fills the silence with possibilities. But investigators were already working to close that distance. The body from Jeremy Hill Road was transferred for examination. The scene had been damaged by fire, but not everything had been erased. Police still had evidence to process. They still had forensic avenues to follow. They still had the basic question every unidentified death investigation begins with: who is she? That question led investigators back across state lines. Information from Suffolk County Police helped connect the remains found in Connecticut to Rebecca Koster. Dental records were used to confirm her identity, bringing an end to one question and opening a far worse one. Rebecca had been found, but not alive. For her family, identification did not bring relief. It brought confirmation of the thing no one wanted to say out loud. The missing person case had become a homicide investigation. The daughter they were looking for had been the woman found burning beside a rural Connecticut road. That kind of discovery changes everything. It changes the way the last conversations are remembered. It changes the meaning of every unanswered call. It turns ordinary details from the night before into evidence. Where was she? Who saw her? Who contacted her? Who knew where she was going? Who had access to her in the hours after she was last known to be safe? The investigation now had a name, and that name gave the case direction. Rebecca was no longer an unidentified victim. She was a 24-year-old woman from Medford, New York. She had a family. She had a missing person report. She had a timeline that could be traced backward from Connecticut to Suffolk County, from Jeremy Hill Road to Patchogue, from the fire to the bar, from the discovery to the final hours of her life. And that is where the immediate reaction became the beginning of the investigation. Because once Rebecca was identified, the case was not just about the body on the roadside anymore. It was about the people who last saw her alive. It was about the movements that brought her from New York to Connecticut. It was about the person who had tried to hide her, burn her, and delay the moment her name would be spoken again. But Rebecca's name did come back, and once it did, investigators could finally begin asking the question that mattered most. Who was with her before she died? Investigators started with the only place they could start: the body. Rebecca had been found in Connecticut, but her life, her last known movements, and her missing person report all pointed back to New York. That meant this investigation could not stay inside one jurisdiction. Connecticut State Police had the scene. Suffolk County had the missing woman. And slowly, those two investigations began moving toward the same answer. The first major task was identification. The fire had damaged the body, but it had not erased everything. Dental records helped confirm that the woman found on Jeremy Hill Road was Rebecca Koster, a 24-year-old from Medford, New York. Once investigators had her name, they had more than a victim. They had a timeline to rebuild. They could now ask who saw her last, where she had gone, who contacted her, and how she ended up across state lines. That trail led back to Butcher Boys, the bar in Patchogue, where Rebecca had been in the early morning hours of the 4th of December, 2009. Surveillance footage and witness information placed her there. And inside that same timeline was a man named Evans Ganthier. At first, that may have been only one piece of the puzzle. A man at the same bar, a conversation, a possible connection. But investigations do not turn on one detail alone. They turn when separate details begin pointing in the same direction. And in this case, they did. Phone records became one of the next important pieces. Investigators looked at who contacted Rebecca, when the calls happened, and what phone activity showed during the window when she disappeared. Ganthier's name did not stay on the edge of the case. The records pulled him closer. Then came the physical evidence. Duct tape had been used in connection with Rebecca's body. That kind of evidence matters because it can hold what a person tries to leave behind without realizing it. Fingerprints, touch evidence, small traces of contact. Investigators recovered fingerprints from the duct tape, and those fingerprints were linked to Evans Ganthier. That discovery shifted the case. Now Ganthier was not just a man who had crossed paths with Rebecca at a bar. He was connected to material associated with the concealment of her body. The investigation was no longer asking whether he might have known her. It was asking what role he played after she left the ordinary world of friends, phone calls, and late-night plans. And when detectives spoke to Ganthier, the case moved into an even darker place. Ganthier admitted he had been with Rebecca. He admitted she had died while she was with him. He admitted taking steps afterward that were not consistent with someone simply trying to get help. But he denied murdering her. His explanation was that Rebecca became sick, then suffered an accident in his garage. According to his version, she slipped, fell, struck her head on the concrete floor, and began bleeding heavily. He claimed he tried to drive her to a hospital, but that she died in his car before he got there. If that had been the whole truth, the next step should have been obvious. Call 911, go to police, tell someone immediately. But that is not what Ganthier did. Instead, by his own account, he panicked. He moved Rebecca's body. He transported her out of New York and into Connecticut. He left her along a rural road, and he burned her remains. That is where the evidence began speaking louder than his explanation. Because panic can explain fear. It can explain hesitation. It can explain a delayed call. But it does not easily explain a body moved across state lines. It does not easily explain fire. It does not easily explain actions that appear designed to destroy evidence, delay identification, and separate Rebecca from the place where she was last known to be alive. Still, investigators had to prove more than concealment. That was the central problem in the case. The aftermath was horrifying, but murder required proof that Ganthier caused Rebecca's death. So investigators and prosecutors needed the medical evidence to answer the question at the center of everything. Did Rebecca die from an accident, as Ganthier claimed, or was she killed before her body was burned? The autopsy became critical. The medical findings identified sharp force injuries, including wounds to Rebecca's abdomen and neck. Prosecutors would later rely on those findings to argue that Rebecca did not die from a fall in a garage. Their position was that she was stabbed while alive, and that the burning of her body came afterward as an attempt to cover up the crime. The defense would challenge that. They would argue that Rebecca's death was accidental and that the knife wounds were not proof of murder. They would try to separate what Ganthier admitted doing after Rebecca died from the question of whether he caused her death in the first place. That distinction became the heart of the case. Investigators had evidence placing Ganthier near Rebecca's final known timeline. They had phone records. They had surveillance. They had fingerprints on duct tape. They had his own statements connecting him to the disposal and burning of her body. Piece by piece, the investigation had pulled him from the background into the center. But the final question was not only whether Ganthier had lied, it was whether the evidence could prove that Rebecca Koster was murdered before her body was taken to Jeremy Hill Road. And that question would follow the case into court. The reveal in Rebecca Koster's case was not a single sudden confession. It was a collision between two versions of the same night. On one side was the prosecution's version. Rebecca did not die by accident. She was killed. According to the state, the injuries found during the autopsy showed that Rebecca had suffered sharp force wounds while she was still alive. The most important of those injuries was a stab wound to the abdomen. which prosecutors argued was the cause of her death. In that version, the burning of Rebecca's body was not the beginning of the crime. It was the cover-up. The prosecution argued that after killing Rebecca, Evans Ganthier moved her body out of New York, brought her to a rural road in Connecticut, and set her remains on fire to hide evidence and delay identification. To the state, his actions after her death showed consciousness of guilt. This was not a man who had witnessed a terrible accident and panicked for a few minutes. This was a man who transported a dead woman across state lines, tried to destroy her body, and left her beside a road where a stranger would find her burning. But Ganthier's account told a different story. He admitted that Rebecca had been with him. He admitted that she died while in his presence. He admitted that he moved her body and burned her remains, but he denied murdering her. According to his version, Rebecca became sick, ended up in his garage, slipped, fell, and struck her head on the concrete floor. He claimed she was bleeding badly and that he tried to drive her to a hospital. He said she died in his car before he arrived. Then, in fear and panic, he made the decision that would forever define the case. Instead of calling 911, instead of going to police, instead of telling the truth immediately, he tried to hide what had happened. That was the defense's central point. Ganthier may have done terrible things after Rebecca died, but terrible actions after a death do not automatically prove murder. The defense wanted the jury to separate two questions that emotionally feel connected, but legally are not the same. What did Ganthier do to Rebecca's body? And did Ganthier cause Rebecca's death? The prosecution needed the jury to answer both questions in a way that pointed to murder. The defense needed only to create doubt about the second one. That made the medical evidence the heart of the reveal. If Rebecca died from a fall, then Ganthier's actions afterward were horrific, but the state's murder theory would be weaker. If Rebecca died from a stab wound inflicted while she was alive, then his story of an accidental fall began to collapse. The case turned on whether the injuries were consistent with homicide, and whether the jury believed the medical evidence proved Rebecca was alive when those wounds were inflicted. The prosecution presented the autopsy findings as the answer. The defense attacked the interpretation. And between those two versions sat Rebecca, no longer able to speak, no longer able to explain how her final moments unfolded, represented only by the evidence left behind. That is what makes the reveal in this case so unsettling. It is not only that Ganthier was connected to Rebecca's final hours. It is not only that his fingerprints were linked to the duct tape. It is not only that he admitted moving and burning her body. It is that his own story required the jury to believe he was innocent of murder while guilty of almost everything that looked like a cover-up. A tragic accident, followed by panic, or a killing, followed by an attempt to erase the victim. Those were the two stories placed in front of the jury. And in 2013, the jury accepted the prosecution's version. Ganthier was found guilty of second-degree murder. Legally, at that moment, the case had an answer. But years later, that answer would be shaken. Not because a court declared Ganthier innocent, not because Rebecca's death stopped being suspicious, but because the very evidence used to prove how she died would become the center of a constitutional fight. The reveal then had two layers. The first was the prosecution's claim that Rebecca had been murdered, not lost to an accident. The second was the later realization that proving that claim in court required more than a powerful theory. It required the right evidence, presented the right way. In 2013, the case against Evans Ganthier reached the point every family waits for and fears at the same time: trial. For Rebecca Koster's loved ones, the courtroom was supposed to be the place where the evidence finally became an answer. The fire on Jeremy Hill Road, the missing person report, the bar in Patchogue, the phone records, the duct tape, the medical findings, and Ganthier's own statements all came together before a Suffolk County jury. The prosecution argued that Rebecca had been murdered. The defense argued that Ganthier had panicked after an accidental death. And the jury had to decide whether the state had proven something more than concealment, more than fear, and more than horrifying conduct after Rebecca died. They had to decide whether Ganthier had caused her death. In August 2013, the jury reached its verdict. Evans Ganthier was found guilty of second-degree murder. The following month, in September 2013, he was sentenced to an indeterminate prison term of 25 years to life. Legally, it looked like the case had reached closure. The state had its conviction, Rebecca's family had a judgment, and the man prosecutors said killed her was sent to prison. But the legal story did not end there. Ganthier appealed, and in 2021, the New York Appellate Division affirmed his conviction. That meant the verdict survived direct review in state court. The conviction remained in place, and for years, Rebecca's case appeared to be legally resolved. Then the case moved into federal court. Ganthier filed a habeas petition, challenging the conviction on constitutional grounds. His strongest argument centered on the autopsy evidence, the same evidence that had been crucial to proving cause of death. At trial, the doctor who performed Rebecca's autopsy did not testify. Instead, the prosecution relied on another medical examiner, Dr. Harold Wayne Carver, who testified about findings based on the autopsy materials and report. That mattered because Rebecca's cause of death was the central dispute in the case. If she died from a stab wound inflicted while she was alive, the prosecution's murder theory became much stronger. If she died from an accidental fall, as Ganthier claimed, then the legal picture changed dramatically. The federal court looked at that issue and found a constitutional problem. On the 26th of August, 2025, U.S. District Judge Nina R. Morrison granted Ganthier's habeas petition on his Sixth Amendment Confrontation Clause claim. The court concluded that the prosecution's use of the autopsy report and surrogate testimony, without calling the doctor who actually performed the autopsy, violated Ganthier's right to confront the witness behind the key medical findings. And the court found that the error was not harmless. That point is critical. Some trial errors are considered serious, but not serious enough to undo a conviction. Here, the federal court said the autopsy evidence was too central to the prosecution's case. Cause of death was not a side issue. It was the heart of the trial. It was the line between Ganthier being guilty of horrific concealment after Rebecca's death and being guilty of murdering her. So the court vacated the conviction and remanded the case for a new trial. But this does not mean Ganthier was declared innocent. It does not mean the court decided Rebecca was not murdered. And it does not erase what Ganthier admitted doing after Rebecca died. It means that the conviction, as it stood, could not survive because the court found the trial had violated a constitutional safeguard. The state was still allowed to appeal that ruling or retry the case. But the old conviction no longer stood in the same way. After the federal ruling, the state appealed to the Second Circuit. That is where the case became painful all over again. More than a decade after the jury's verdict, Rebecca's family was pulled back into legal uncertainty. The case that once seemed closed had been reopened, not because the tragedy was questioned, but because the way the evidence was presented at trial was. Legally, Rebecca Koster's case had entered another chapter. Emotionally, for the people who loved her, it was the same wound being opened again. The lesson in Rebecca Koster's case is not simple. It is not the kind of lesson that can be reduced to one warning about a night out, one person, or one bad decision. That would make the story too small. Rebecca's death was not just the result of one dangerous moment. It became a case about evidence, proof, procedure, and what happens when a family believes a legal ending has finally arrived, only to watch that ending become uncertain years later. At the center of this case is a painful truth. Justice is not only about finding an answer, it is about proving that answer in a way strong enough to survive. For Rebecca's family, the facts that surrounded her death were devastating. Her body was found burning beside a rural road in Connecticut. She had been moved away from New York. Her identity had been damaged, delayed, and nearly erased. The man later convicted in her death admitted to being with her, admitted to moving her body, and admitted to burning her remains. Those facts alone carry enormous emotional weight. But a courtroom does not decide murder by emotional weight. It asks a colder question. What can be proven? That distinction is what makes this case so important. Ganthier's actions after Rebecca died were horrifying, but the murder charge required proof that he caused her death. The prosecution had to do more than show panic, concealment, or guilt after the fact. They had to prove that Rebecca was killed, and that Ganthier was responsible for killing her. That is why the cause of death became the heart of the case. If Rebecca died from a stab wound inflicted while she was alive, the prosecution's theory became much stronger. If she died from an accidental fall, as Ganthier claimed, then the legal meaning of everything that followed changed. The burning of her body would still be monstrous, the concealment would still matter, but the legal question of murder would be more difficult, and that is where procedure matters. To many people outside the courtroom, procedure can sound technical, almost cold. It can feel frustrating when a conviction is challenged years later because of how evidence was introduced. But procedure is not separate from justice. Procedure is part of justice. It is the structure that is supposed to make sure the right evidence is tested in the right way, especially when someone's freedom and a victim's truth both depend on it. In Rebecca's case, the federal court did not say the tragedy was less real. It did not say Ganthier was innocent. It did not say Rebecca's family had not suffered. It said the conviction could not stand because a constitutional safeguard had been violated at trial. That is a difficult thing to sit with, because for families, a vacated conviction does not feel like a legal technicality. It feels like being pulled back to the beginning. It feels like the courtroom door opening again after everyone had tried to survive what happened the first time. And that may be the deepest lesson here. A case can be emotionally powerful and still require careful proof. A defendant can behave in ways that look deeply guilty, and the state still has to prove the exact legal charge. A family can receive a verdict, and years later discover that the legal system did not build that verdict on ground strong enough to hold. Rebecca Koster deserved a life beyond 24 years old. Her family deserved answers that did not collapse into renewed uncertainty. And the public deserves to understand that justice is not weakened by careful procedure. It is weakened when procedure is ignored, and a case has to be reopened years later. We tell stories like Rebecca's not because tragedy needs to be repeated, but because the pattern matters. The truth must be found. The evidence must be tested. And when a victim can no longer speak, the system has to be strong enough to speak for her without failing her twice. Rebecca Koster's case does not end cleanly. It does not close with a simple final line, a locked verdict, or the kind of certainty families are supposed to receive after enduring the unimaginable. For a time, it looked like the legal system had given Rebecca's family an answer. Evans Ganthier had been convicted of second-degree murder. He had been sentenced to 25 years to life. The case had moved through appeal, and the conviction had been affirmed. But then, years later, the ground shifted. A federal court looked back at the trial and found a constitutional problem with the way the most important medical evidence had been presented. The conviction was vacated. The case was sent back toward the possibility of a new trial. And suddenly, what had once seemed legally settled was open again. That does not erase Rebecca. It does not erase the road in Connecticut. It does not erase the fire. It does not erase the fact that a 24-year-old woman from Medford, New York, was found far from home in a place where someone had tried to hide what happened to her. But it does change the ending, because now, Rebecca's story sits in a painful space between grief and law, between what her family lost in 2009 and what the courts are still being asked to decide years later. And that is what makes this ending so heavy. For the public, a vacated conviction can sound like a legal update, a docket entry, a procedural development, a new chapter in an old case. For a family, it is something else entirely. It is the phone call they never wanted to receive again. It is the old wound reopened. It is the possibility of hearing the same evidence, the same arguments, and the same final hours repeated in court after they had already lived through them once. The legal system may still have more to say about Evans Ganthier. There may be more filings, more hearings, more arguments, and possibly another trial. But Rebecca does not get another chapter. She does not get to explain what happened after she left the safety of an ordinary night. She does not get to answer the questions that lawyers are still debating. She does not get to correct the record, defend her own memory, or tell the jury what her final moments were like. All that remains is evidence, a timeline, a road, a body that someone tried to erase, and a name that came back anyway. Rebecca Koster was 24 years old. She was from Medford, New York. She had people who searched for her, people who loved her, and a life that should have continued far beyond the 4th of December, 2009. Her case reminds us that justice is not only about reaching a verdict, it is about reaching one that can stand. Because when the system fails to build the ending carefully enough, the people left behind are forced to survive the story twice. And Rebecca's family has already survived more than anyone ever should.